In December 1959, a 53-year-old man walked out of a prison in northeast China carrying one of the strangest biographies of the 20th century. He had once been the son of heaven. He had lived behind the red walls of the Forbidden City, worn imperial robes, and been surrounded by servants who treated his smallest wishes as commands. Now he had no throne, no palace, no legal title, and no country waiting to restore him. His name was Puyi, the last emperor of China, and the most surprising part of his story began after the empire had already ended. The Qing Dynasty had fallen almost half a century earlier. Yet Puyi had somehow been an emperor more than once, a deposed monarch, a restored monarch for a few days, a political exile, the ruler of a Japanese-backed state, a Soviet prisoner, a Chinese war criminal, and finally an ordinary citizen of the People's Republic of China. The question is not simply how he lost his throne. It is how a child raised to believe he stood above everyone else survived long enough to live in a society that officially rejected everything his throne represented. To understand that transformation, we do not need to begin with the founding of the Qing Dynasty. We need to begin with the deal that ended it. On February 12, 1912, the Qing court accepted abdication on behalf of Puyi. He was only 6 years old. The revolution that had begun the previous year had shattered imperial authority. Provinces had broken away from Qing rule, and political negotiations produced a new Republic of China. More than 2,000 years of imperial government had come to an end. But the settlement contained a remarkable compromise. Puyi lost sovereignty over China, yet he did not immediately lose the life of an emperor. Under the Articles of Favorable Treatment, he was allowed to keep his imperial title. The new republic promised to treat him with the courtesies associated with a foreign monarch. He could remain in the inner part of the Forbidden City for the time being. The imperial household was promised a large annual subsidy, and the new government agreed to protect Qing temples and tombs. This created an almost surreal political arrangement. Outside the palace walls, China had become a republic. Inside them, a miniature imperial world continued. Puyi was no longer the ruler of the country, but servants still bowed. Court rituals continued. Imperial language survived. The boy still occupied rooms built for emperors. For a child, the distinction between having a title and having real political power was not easy to understand. He had lost an empire before he was old enough to understand what an empire was. In one sense, this protected him. There was no execution, no immediate exile, and no revolutionary mob dragging the child emperor through the streets. In another sense, it preserved the illusion that the fall of the dynasty might not be permanent. That illusion would matter for the rest of his life. Puyi's childhood inside the Forbidden City was luxurious, but it was also deeply abnormal. He grew up surrounded by rules that reinforced his uniqueness. Adults were expected to obey him. Eunuchs and attendants handled ordinary tasks. His world was physically separated from the city beyond the walls. He could see modern China changing, but he did not live like the people living in it. The republic itself was unstable. Presidents, generals, warlords, and political factions competed for power. For Qing loyalists, that disorder created hope. If the republic looked weak, perhaps monarchy could return. In July 1917, that hope briefly became reality. The warlord and Qing loyalist Zhang soon entered Beijing and attempted to restore the monarchy. Puyi, still a child, was placed back on the throne. Imperial flags appeared again. Former officials returned to court dress. For a few extraordinary days, the dead dynasty seemed to be alive. It lasted less than 2 weeks. Republican forces moved against the restoration. Fighting broke out around Beijing. Aircraft dropped bombs near the Forbidden City, one of the earliest examples of aerial bombing in Chinese political conflict. The restoration collapsed. Zhang soon fled for protection, and Puyi abdicated again. For most people, that failed restoration proved how little future the Qing monarchy had. But for Puyi, the lesson could be read differently. Someone had restored him once. Perhaps someone could do it again. That possibility became part of his identity. As he entered adolescence, the Forbidden City became less like the center of a government and more like an island from another age. Puyi received a more modern education. His Scottish tutor, Reginald Johnston, taught him English and introduced him to aspects of Western life. Puyi became interested in Western clothes, bicycles, spectacles, and new technology. He even used the English name Henry. The contrast was strange. He could dress like a modern young man while still being addressed as emperor inside a court that no longer ruled anything. Money also became a problem. The Republican government did not consistently deliver everything promised under the old settlement. The imperial household remained expensive. Large numbers of servants had to be supported, and the ownership of the enormous palace collections became increasingly sensitive. Valuable objects moved out of the Forbidden City, while officials and members of the household argued over what belonged personally to the former imperial family and what belonged to the state. That property question mattered because the monarchy had never functioned like a modern private household. The emperor's residence, the imperial collection, and the machinery of the state had been intertwined for centuries. Once the empire disappeared, dividing the emperor's property from China's property became politically explosive. Puyi was also expected to marry like an emperor, even though there was no longer an empire. In 1922, he married Wanrong, who became his empress in the surviving court tradition, and Wenxiu, who became a consort. Their marriages took place inside a political world that was already fading. The titles remained ceremonial. The old household hierarchy remained. But the country outside had moved on. Then, in 1924, the strange compromise created in 1912 finally broke. A coup brought the warlord Feng Yuxiang to power in Beijing. The favorable treatment agreement was revised. Puyi's remaining imperial privileges were stripped away. His title was no longer to carry official standing. He and the imperial household were ordered out of the Forbidden City. This was the moment when the fall of the empire became physical. In 1912, Puyi had lost China but kept the palace. In 1924, he lost the palace too. He was given only a short time to leave. The gates that had protected the imperial household for generations closed behind the last emperor. Puyi stayed briefly at his father's residence, then sought protection at the Japanese legation. Soon afterward, he moved to Tianjin, where he lived in the Japanese concession. A year later, in 1925, the Forbidden City became the Palace Museum. The struggle over the palace collections made the separation even more final. The revised settlement distinguished private property claimed by the former imperial family from public property attached to the dynasty and the state. That sounds tidy on paper, but the reality was anything but tidy. For years, objects had moved through a household in which court property, personal gifts, inherited treasures, ceremonial objects, and state collections had existed side by side. After Puyi's departure, officials conducted a vast inventory. The surviving imperial holdings formed the core of the Palace Museum, with more than 1 million objects recorded in the early cataloging work. So Puyi did not merely lose a building. He lost control over the material world that had made emperorship visible. Thrones, paintings, bronzes, ceramics, robes, books, seals, furniture, and ritual spaces could now be interpreted by a republican state instead of used by an imperial household. The old court had become a collection to be counted. That mattered psychologically. A throne can be imagined as recoverable. A dynasty can tell itself that politics might reverse. But once the rooms are opened, the objects inventoried, and the public invited in, monarchy begins to look less like a government temporarily displaced and more like a civilization already being archived. Think about that reversal. The home from which ordinary people had once been excluded became a public institution. The imperial collections that had represented dynastic ownership became part of a national museum. Puyi was still alive, still young, still calling himself the heir of an imperial tradition, while his former home was already being turned into history. If the story had ended there, he would have been remembered as a deposed child monarch living in comfortable exile. But Tianjin changed the scale of his ambition. Puyi did not arrive there as a poor refugee. He still possessed prestige, connections, valuable possessions, and the fascination that followed the last emperor of China. He and Wanrong moved within cosmopolitan society. Foreign diplomats and political figures knew who he was. Japanese officials took particular interest in him. and Puyi still wanted restoration. This is where his story becomes morally more complicated. It is tempting to describe everything that happened next as something done to him. Japan certainly manipulated him. Japanese military power would eventually control the state over which he claimed to rule. But Puyi was not simply an unwilling stranger dragged into Manchuria without dreams of his own. He wanted his throne back. He believed his family had been wronged. He was willing to work with outside power if that outside power could return him to political importance. That choice would define the darkest part of his life. In September 1931, Japanese forces seized Manchuria after the Mukden incident and rapidly expanded their control across northeast China. Japan then sponsored the creation of a new state called Manchukuo. For Japanese strategists, Puyi was useful. He was a Manchu. He was the last Qing emperor. His name could give the new regime a historical appearance that Japanese military occupation alone could never provide. For Puyi, Manchuria offered something he had wanted for nearly 20 years. A path back toward a throne. He secretly left Tianjin and went northeast. But when Manchukuo was formally established in 1932, Puyi did not immediately become emperor. He was made chief executive. The title disappointed him. He wanted restoration of the Qing monarchy, not merely leadership of a new Japanese-sponsored state. Still, he accepted. 2 years later, in 1934, he received the crown he had been waiting for. Puyi became emperor of Manchukuo under the reign name Qingda. On paper, the transformation was astonishing. The boy who had lost the Chinese throne had become an emperor again. In reality, he had entered a different kind of cage. Manchukuo possessed ministries, ceremonies, flags, uniforms, and the language of independent statehood, but Japanese military and political advisors exercised decisive influence. Contemporary diplomatic reporting described the overwhelming Japanese presence behind the government. The Guangdong Army was the power that had made the state possible, and it remained the force capable of determining its direction. Puyi had a throne, but not the sovereignty he had imagined. That contradiction defined his reign. He could appear in uniform, receive officials, travel ceremonially, and sign state documents. Yet major decisions were shaped by Japanese power. His court was monitored. His movements were constrained. His government existed inside the strategic system of the Japanese Empire. He had spent years believing that the loss of a throne was his great humiliation. Manchukuo showed him that possessing a throne without control could be another kind of humiliation. But that does not erase his responsibility. Puyi accepted the position. He lent his name to the regime. He participated in its ceremonies and state structure. He benefited from the status it gave him. People living under Manchukuo experienced police repression, political control, forced economic transformation, and the violence of Japanese imperial expansion. The question of how much freedom Puyi personally possessed does not change the fact that his authority helped give the regime an imperial face. That is why later attempts to present him only as a victim are incomplete. He was both manipulated and ambitious, both controlled and complicit. The Japanese used his desire for restoration, and his desire for restoration made him willing to be used. His private life also deteriorated. Wanrong, the empress who had married him in Beijing, became increasingly isolated and dependent on opium. The imperial marriage had never become a stable family life. Puyi and Wanrong had no children. Wanxiu, the consort who had married him at the same time, had already left him and obtained a divorce in 1931, an extraordinary public embarrassment for a man still clinging to imperial identity. Later companions entered Puyi's household, but no heir was born. For a dynasty that had ruled China for centuries, this mattered. Restoration was not simply about putting Puyi back on a throne. A monarchy also required succession. Yet the last emperor of China would never have a child. That gave his political dream an odd fragility. Even if every obstacle had disappeared, there was no son waiting behind him to continue a restored imperial line. The personal and political problems became more severe as the Japanese war in China expanded. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Manchukuo was deeply integrated into Japan's wartime system. Puyi traveled to Japan and met Emperor Hirohito. He performed the role expected of a monarch allied to Tokyo. Yet the further Japan pushed into China and across Asia, the more Puyi's fate became tied to a military empire that could survive only if Japan won the war. It did not. In August 1945, the Soviet Union entered the war against Japan and launched a massive offensive into Manchuria. Japanese defenses collapsed with extraordinary speed. The state that had given Puyi his second imperial career began disintegrating around him. This was the cinematic ending to his final throne. The Japanese Empire was surrendering. Communications failed. Officials fled. Soldiers and civilians struggled to escape. Puyi and members of his household moved away from the capital as the Soviet advance approached. 4 years, Manchukuo had been presented as a permanent state with an emperor, ministries, and ceremony. In a matter of days, it vanished. Puyi abdicated again. This time there was no treaty preserving his title and no forbidden city waiting to shelter him. He tried to escape. On August 19, 1945, Puyi reached the airport at Shenyang, then widely known as Mukden, expecting to continue towards safety, ultimately hoping to reach Japan. Soviet forces arrived first. The last emperor of China and former emperor of Manchukuo became a prisoner of the Red Army. The man who had spent much of his life waiting for someone to restore him now had no state at all. The collapse of Manchukuo also destroyed what remained of Puyi's household. In the confusion of retreat, the imperial party split apart. Puyi escaped by air with a small group, including his brother Puyi, while Wanrong and other women of the household were left to make a different journey. They were later captured in China. Wanrong's fate was especially bleak. By then, years of opium dependence and isolation had seriously damaged her health. She died in captivity in 1946. Puyi was not with her. He later learned of her death while himself a prisoner. The contrast with their wedding in the Forbidden City could hardly have been greater. Wanrong had entered Puyi's life wearing the title of Empress after the Chinese Empire had already fallen. She died after the collapse of a second throne that had never given her a secure home. There was no restored dynasty, no imperial funeral that returned the household to greatness, and no child to carry Puyi's direct line forward. This was not simply the collapse of a government. It was the final breakup of the court as a family system. The Soviets took him into custody and eventually moved him to the Soviet Far East. His captivity there was far more comfortable than the fate he feared. He was housed rather than thrown into the kind of brutal punishment camp he may have expected. For a time, he still had attendance and remained dependent on other people for ordinary tasks. Even as a prisoner, he had not yet fully learned how to live as an ordinary man. But his legal position was dangerous. The Republic of China regarded him as a collaborator and traitor. His association with Japan was undeniable. If he were returned to a Chinese government determined to punish collaboration, he could face severe consequences. In 1946, the Soviets brought him to Tokyo to testify at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, the major Allied war crimes trial of Japanese leaders. There, Puyi tried to shape the story of Manchukuo. He emphasized Japanese coercion and portrayed himself as a captive figure with little meaningful freedom. Much of that was true in the sense that Japanese military power dominated the regime. But the defense challenged the idea that he had been entirely unwilling. Evidence from his own earlier behavior showed that he had actively pursued restoration and had cooperated with Japanese plans when he believed they could benefit him. The courtroom exposed the central contradiction of his adult life. Puyi wanted the world to see a prisoner. History also saw a collaborator. After the trial, he returned to Soviet custody. He reportedly hoped he might be allowed to remain in the Soviet Union. But the political map of China was changing again. In 1949, the Chinese Communist Party won the mainland's civil war and established the People's Republic of China. The following year, the Soviet Union transferred Puyi back to China. He was terrified. He had good reason to be. The new government had fought Japanese occupation and civil war. Puyi had served as the emperor of a Japanese-sponsored regime. He represented the Qing monarchy, collaboration, privilege, and the social order the communist revolution claimed to have destroyed. He expected death. Instead, he was sent to the Fushun War Criminals Management Center in Liaoning. That decision opened the most remarkable phase of his life. The purpose of Fushun was not simply confinement. The Chinese government intended to reform prisoners politically. Former Japanese officers, nationalist officials, and Manchukuo figures were made to study, work, confess, and reconsider their past. For Puyi, this meant confronting something he had been protected from since childhood: responsibility. He had spent much of his life in environments where other people did things for him. Servants dressed him. Officials organized his household. Advisors managed political reality. Japanese officers controlled Manchukuo. Again and again, he could tell himself that events happened around him. Prison removed that protective distance. He had to learn ordinary routines. He had to participate in group life. He had to listen to accounts of what Japanese occupation and Manchukuo had meant for people who had not lived in palaces. He was pressed to examine his own cooperation with the regime rather than describing himself only as its victim. The process was ideological and carefully managed by the communist state. Puyi's later autobiography, produced in this political environment, cannot simply be treated as a neutral private confession. The government had every reason to present him as proof that even the embodiment of the old order could be transformed into a socialist citizen. But something real also happened inside that controlled story. Puyi became more capable of ordinary life. The change was not instant. Accounts of his imprisonment describe a man who initially struggled with basic tasks because servants had always handled them. That is almost impossible to imagine until you remember how he had been raised. For most people, dressing, cleaning, organizing belongings, or managing daily routines are learned in childhood. Puyi's childhood had taught him the opposite lesson. Other people existed to do those things for him. Fushun forced him to unlearn the habits of a palace. The deeper change concerned status. In the Forbidden City, he had been told he was above everyone. In Manchukuo, he had tried to recover that position. At Fushun, survival depended on accepting that he was one prisoner among others. This is where the title Last Emperor begins to mean something different. Puyi did not simply become a monarch who no longer ruled. He had to become a person who no longer expected monarchy to define him. Then, on December 4, 1959, the state gave him another reversal. Puyi received a special pardon. He was free. The last emperor of China walked out of prison not as an emperor in exile, not as a claimant waiting for restoration, and not as the protected guest of a foreign power. He walked out as a citizen of the People's Republic of China. There was no palace household waiting for him. No imperial subsidy. No court. No army. No Japanese advisors. No loyalist restoration plan. For the first time in his life, Puyi's future did not depend on a throne. He returned to Beijing. The city contained the physical remains of almost every version of his past. The Forbidden City was still there, but now it was the Palace Museum. The Republican era had passed. The Japanese occupation had passed. The nationalist government had left the mainland. The communist state now ruled from the same capital where Puyi had once been carried into imperial power as a toddler. His new life was deliberately ordinary. He lived with relatives for a period and worked in Beijing, including as a gardener at the botanical gardens. The contrast is so perfect that it can sound invented. A man once surrounded by imperial gardens now tending plants as an employee. But the important point is not humiliation. It is competence. Ordinary life required skills imperial life had never taught him. He had to move through the city without ceremonial protection. He had to deal with schedules, work, public spaces, and people who were not required to bow. Accounts of his later years describe his awkwardness with practical life, but also his fascination with being part of it. The former emperor could travel through Beijing as one citizen among millions. And there was an even sharper symbol waiting in the center of the city. The Forbidden City was no longer his home. He could enter it as a visitor. The place where he had once been treated as the center of the political universe now displayed that world behind museum ropes and glass. Objects that had belonged to an imperial system were catalogued, preserved, and interpreted for the public. For Puyi, the palace had changed from residence to evidence. That may be the most complete measure of what he had lost. Not wealth alone. Not a title alone. His entire childhood world had become an exhibit. Yet his life after prison was not merely a story of decline. In some ways, it was the first period in which he built relationships without a throne standing between himself and everyone else. In April 1962, Puyi married Li Shuxian, a hospital nurse. She was not chosen as an empress for a dynasty. She entered his life after the monarchy, after Manchukuo, after Soviet captivity, and after prison. They had no children. By then, succession no longer had political meaning anyway. China had no recognized imperial office to inherit. Puyi's marriage was a private relationship in a republic that had abolished the world of imperial ranks. He also became involved with the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. He worked in a literary and editorial role and later became a member of its national committee. The symbolism was unmistakable. The man who had once been the hereditary ruler of an empire now held a place inside a political institution of the state that had replaced every form of monarchy he had known. His autobiography, commonly known in English as From Emperor to Citizen, became central to this final identity. It told the story of his transformation from privileged ruler to reformed citizen. The book was shaped by the political environment in which it was produced, and historians have good reason to read parts of it critically. Puyi had motives to minimize some responsibilities at certain moments and to emphasize his reform at others. Still, the title captured the direction of his life with unusual accuracy. He had begun as an emperor before he could speak for himself politically. He ended as a citizen who had spent decades learning what personal responsibility meant. The final years were not peaceful in the wider sense. In 1966, the Cultural Revolution began. The movement targeted symbols of old society, and few people embodied the old order more visibly than Puyi. Members of the former imperial family faced pressure and harassment. Puyi's own past made him vulnerable, although he was protected from some of the worst public violence that consumed others. His health was already failing. On October 17, 1967, Puyi died in Beijing at the age of 61. He suffered from serious kidney disease and heart problems, with kidney cancer among the conditions reported in accounts of his death. There was no imperial funeral. Under the laws and practices of the People's Republic, his body was cremated. His ashes were placed at Babaoshan Revolutionary Cemetery in Beijing. That alone would have been a remarkable ending. The last emperor of the Qing Dynasty resting in a cemetery associated with the revolutionary state that succeeded imperial China. But even his grave would move. In 1995, nearly 3 decades after his death, Puyi's ashes were transferred to the Hualong Imperial Cemetery, a commercial cemetery near the western Qing tombs. Several earlier Qing emperors lie in the Great Imperial Burial Complex nearby. Puyi does not rest inside a completed imperial mausoleum built for a reigning emperor. His grave sits near the world of his ancestors, but not fully inside it. That physical distance feels almost like a map of his life. Close to the dynasty, never restored to it. And what happened to the imperial family after him? Puyi left no children, so there is no direct line of sons or daughters descending from China's last emperor. The wider Eisenjoro clan, however, did not disappear. His younger brother Puyi survived him, and other branches of the family continued. Puyi's younger half-brother Purin, who commonly used the Chinese surname Jin, had children and lived an ordinary professional life in the People's Republic. Some modern genealogical and media accounts describe Purin's son, Jin Yuzhong, as the present head of the Eisenjoro house. But that is a family or dynastic convention, not a legal royal position. The People's Republic of China recognizes no Qing throne, no imperial succession, and no political privileges attached to the old clan. That distinction matters. Even the idea of a single unquestioned heir is less straightforward than it sounds. Qing succession had not historically operated as a simple European-style rule in which the eldest son automatically inherited. Emperors designated successors, and later private genealogical claims about leadership of the former house cannot recreate a legal throne that no longer exists. Modern references that call one relative the head of the house are describing family continuity, not an office recognized by the Chinese state. That difference prevents a common misunderstanding. The survival of royal blood does not mean the survival of monarchy. There are living descendants of the wider imperial clan, but there is no constitutional mechanism waiting to turn one of them into emperor. The political chain was broken in 1912 and the last remnants of official privilege were removed in 1924. What remains is ancestry, memory, scholarship, family tradition, and public fascination. The family survived. The institution did not. For centuries, the Eisenjoro name had been connected to the state itself. By the late 20th and early 21st centuries, descendants could live as teachers, artists, civil servants, professionals, or private citizens. Their connection to the Qing became genealogy and history rather than government. The same transformation happened to the family's greatest physical symbol. The Forbidden City survived, but it survived by ceasing to be forbidden. Today it is the Palace Museum, one of the most important cultural institutions in China. The throne rooms remain. The courtyards remain. The roofs, gates, ceremonial spaces, and imperial collections still communicate the scale of the world Puyi inherited as a child. Yet the meaning has completely reversed. The palace no longer proves that one family rules China. It proves that one family once did. That difference explains Puyi's entire life. When the Qing Empire fell in 1912, Puyi did not immediately become ordinary. The new republic protected his title and household, allowing the habits of monarchy to survive after political power disappeared. That delay shaped him. It taught him to see restoration as possible. When restoration briefly came in 1917, it lasted only days. When the palace was taken from him in 1924, he looked for another route back. When Japan offered him power in Manchuria, he accepted because he believed a throne could restore what history had taken away. Instead, he became emperor of a state dominated by another empire. When that empire collapsed, he became a prisoner. And when prison finally ended, the surprising thing was not that he failed to regain his crown. It was that he stopped needing one in order to have a life. There is a temptation to make Puyi's story too neat. To say he began as a spoiled emperor, learned his lesson, and became a humble citizen. History is more difficult than that. His communist-era transformation took place inside a state-directed system of political reeducation. His autobiography was shaped by official expectations. His testimony about Manchukuo sometimes minimized his own ambitions. His role under Japan cannot be excused simply because Japanese officers controlled him. The suffering of people under occupation was far greater than the discomfort of a monarch frustrated by limits on his authority. At the same time, reducing him to a willing puppet misses something important too. Puyi had been shaped from childhood by an institution designed to convince one person that he stood at the center of the world. He lost that institution before he was mature enough to understand himself outside it. For decades, he searched for political structures that could give the old identity back to him. The Republic could not. The Loyalist Restoration could not. Japan appeared to do so, but only by turning his title into a tool of Japanese empire. The Soviets reduced him to a captive. Fushun reduced him to a prisoner. Only after all of those identities were stripped away did Puyi become something he had never been trained to be: a private individual. That is why the most important contrast in his story is not emperor versus prisoner. It is emperor versus citizen. A prisoner still lives inside a hierarchy someone else controls. Puyi had spent his entire life inside hierarchies. The court controlled his childhood. Warlords controlled his security. Japanese officers controlled Manchukuo. The Soviets controlled his captivity. The Chinese state controlled his imprisonment and political reform. Citizenship, however limited by the politics of the era, gave him an identity that did not require a throne. He could work. He could marry without founding a dynasty. He could walk through Beijing without an imperial procession. He could grow older without waiting for a restoration army. And the country around him could preserve the Qing past without restoring Qing rule. That may be the final irony. Puyi spent much of his adult life trying to recover the symbols of the old empire. Yet those symbols survived most successfully only after they stopped belonging to him. The Forbidden City became a museum. Imperial objects became national cultural treasures. Qing tombs became protected historical sites. The Eisenjoro family became a family rather than a ruling house. And Puyi himself became famous not because he restored the monarchy, but because he lived long enough to witness its complete disappearance. His life crossed an almost impossible distance. He was carried into the Forbidden City as a toddler to become emperor. He left it as a young man after soldiers ended the last privileges of his court. He crossed into Manchuria hoping to become powerful again. He was captured at an airport when that second empire collapsed. He returned to China as a prisoner expecting punishment. He left prison as a citizen. And after death, even his ashes traveled from a revolutionary cemetery to a grave near the imperial tombs his ancestors had built. Not inside the old order. Beside it. Today, if you stand in the Forbidden City, you can still see the spaces that once taught a little boy that he was different from everyone else. The throne is still there. The palace gates are still there. The red walls still separate the courtyards from the city around them. But the people passing through those gates are visitors. The emperor is gone. The dynasty is gone. The family survives without power. And the last man to sit on China's imperial throne is remembered not for rebuilding the empire that fell, but for the extraordinary, compromised, sometimes tragic journey that carried him from the center of an imperial universe into the ordinary life of a citizen. If you think Puyi was more victim than collaborator, or more collaborator than victim, that is the debate his life still leaves behind.